Us. Welcome to our Areopagus Forum this evening. Thanks, as usual, to Eric and Andrea Smith for setting up and hosting our Zoom meeting this evening. And I just wanted to mention that if you're not currently on our email contact list and would like to know about upcoming events and the ministry of the Areopagus in general, please contact us at our website, which is www.theareopagus.org. Also, I'd like to encourage you to check out our Areopagus Facebook page at www.facebook.com/theareopagus, and also our Watchman newsletter, which is compiled and edited by Millie Atkinson. It includes a lot of pertinent information on important issues and news, upcoming events, and other information that informed Christians need to know. Now, as most of you know, the Areopagus sponsors in-depth semester-length seminars on many topics. We just finished a seminar a couple of weeks ago on the inner journey. Beginning next August, our focus will be on the life and works of Dr. Francis Schaeffer, often regarded as the, quote, father of cultural apologetics and one who emphasized the lordship of Jesus Christ over the whole of life, everything from how we understand theology and philosophy and history to how the Christian faith should impact our understanding of the great social and moral issues of our time, everything from the sanctity of life, human sexuality, to politics and the arts. Now, over the last 19 years, the Areopagus has sponsored more than 300 seminars and forums on topics related to Christian apologetics, history, science, significant books and films, Christian spirituality, and contemporary cultural issues. And over the years, we've had so many excellent presentations. About 10 years ago, by the way, we featured our speaker this evening, Warren Cole Smith, and he spoke on a new book that he had recently written and published called A Lover's Quarrel with the Evangelical Church. And the topic of his presentation that evening was the greatest challenge to American Christianity: corruption, hypocrisy, and heresy in the church. Now, he did such a good job that I don't believe that's been a problem ever since, but perhaps not. We better check in with Warren in a few minutes and see if that needs a part two. Now, like I said, over the years, we've had just many excellent presentations. Charlie Thaxton, one of the originators of intelligent design theory, spoke to us years ago on intelligent design, the origins, the theory, and the controversy. We've had Dr. Fazal Rana of Reasons to Believe speak on who was Adam and Eve, Michael Sabom, Dr. Sabom, on science, the soul, and near-death experiences, a Christian analysis. Gary Moon on science, Gary Moon on the life and legacy of Dallas Willard. We brought in Wayne Fetterman from Hollywood, California, to talk about his latest book called The Spiritual Odyssey of Pete Maravich. Eric Smith on was the universe made for man, and if so, what is the evidence? Nancy Piercy spoke a couple of years ago on defining and defending sexual truth in a chaotic culture. Winfried Cordovan spoke to us on who created God, the origins of original monotheism. Rod Dreher on how to be a Christian in a society that no longer is, based on his book, The Benedict Option. And my presentation on the history and philosophy of cultural Marxism and political correctness, based on my book, American Crisis. And of course, this month, our forum features Warren Cole Smith, the founder and president of Ministry Watch. I'll provide a more formal introduction to Warren in just a few minutes. Now, following our presentation, as we typically do, we'll have a Q&A session. We always ask that you keep your questions or comments as brief as possible so we can get in as many as possible. And if you will, enter those comments or questions in the chat feature, and then Eric Smith will monitor that and sort of lead us through those after Warren's presentation this evening. And lastly, before we begin our session, just a few Zoom protocols. Be sure to keep your microphone on mute so we don't pick up any extraneous sounds in talking. And after our speaker's presentation, there are several questions I want to pose to him, after which we'll open things up for Q&A and further discussion. One other thing, and that is that beginning in July, we will have a series every Wednesday evening in July, beginning on July 6th. The first will feature George Weaver, one of our board members, and he'll be talking about his book, The Significant Life, Overcoming Your Fear of Being Unnoticed and Forgotten. Very, very valuable, important book. The following week, Paul Atkinson will talk about the Colson Fellowship Program, Developing a Comprehensive Christian Worldview. After that, Donna Weeks will speak on My Spiritual Pilgrimage from the New Age to New Life in Christ. And then finally, on July 27th, Rhonda Thomas, president of Truth in Education here in Georgia, will speak on new threats to American education, what every Christian needs to know. Now, it's a great honor to have Warren Cole Smith with us this evening. Warren has been the president of Ministry Watch since 2019. Prior to taking on this role, he was vice president of mission advancement for the Colson Center for Christian Worldview. Warren also hosts a weekly podcast entitled Listening In, a long-form interview program heard by tens of thousands of subscribers each week. He previously served as vice president and associate publisher of World News Group, publisher of World Magazine. Many of us are, of course, very familiar with World Magazine. Warren has written more than 3,000 articles, including investigative pieces on various Christian ministries involved in theological controversies, financial or sex scandals. He's also written, co-written, or edited 10 books, including Restoring All Things, God's Audacious Plan to Change the World Through Everyday People. He wrote that, I think, in conjunction with John Stonestreet of the Colson Center. He's also written and published just recently Faith-Based Fraud, Learning from the Great Religious Scandals of Our Time. That was published in 2021, just last year. And then, as I had mentioned, in 2009, he wrote and published A Lover's Quarrel with the Evangelical Church. Warren has a bachelor's degree in journalism and a master's degree in English from the University of Georgia. Warren and his wife, Missy, have been married for 39 years. They have 4 grown children, and they live in Charlotte, North Carolina. And again, it is a great honor and privilege to have Warren. I've known Warren actually, to some extent, most of his life. A couple of years out of college, I was teaching in a local church, and Warren was a senior in high school at the time. And so he was in my class that year. And I remember him being just a very, very attentive and inquisitive student. So Warren, it's great to have you with us this evening, and very much looking forward to your presentation.
Well, thank you, Jeffrey. It's a real honor to be with you. And yeah, you were very formative in my faith development during those years, and I'm grateful to you for that. Thank you very much. And I can't resist mentioning too, I see Paul Atkinson on the Zoom call here, and I'm delighted that he'll be talking about the Colson Fellows. I guess did I catch that next month or so?
In July.
As you mentioned, I spent 4 years at the Colson Center. My wife is a Colson Fellow. My daughter is a Colson Fellow, and so I speak to Colson Fellows groups all over the country, and so I have a very warm spot in my heart for the Colson Center and for the Colson Fellows program. But that is not exactly what we came to talk about tonight. I do, Jeffrey, have a few slides, and I'm wondering what the process is for. Well, can I share my slides without
yes,
a lot of cooperation from
yes.
you? Did that do it?
You're set up to share.
Okay, great. Let me figure out how to see if I can figure this out here. Okay, I don't have many slides, but I just thought it might be helpful to have the slides to go along with what I'm saying. As Jeffrey mentioned, probably about 10 years ago, I actually came to Atlanta for that presentation. We didn't do it over Zoom, and that was a delight to be with you folks face to face. I talked about some of the principles and ideas in my book, A Lover's Quarrel with the Evangelical Church, which, by the way, we are revising and hope to have that book, a revised edition of that book, coming out later this year. Some of the ideas that I will be sharing with you tonight also come from that book, which is one of the reasons why I wanted to redo that book, rewrite that book, because I do think that while there were some things in that book that are dated now that it's nearly 15 years old, and so many of the ideas I thought were evergreen, and it was would be helpful to bring it out again. So when Jeffrey said, okay, you talked about the most common problem of evangelicalism, now I want you to talk about three. I was like, oh my goodness, what do I do, with that? Because I'm sure everybody could come up with their list. So in fact, what I did, Jeffrey, when you asked me to come up with three, I crowdsourced the problem, which of course is what we do now that we live in the future. And I went on to Facebook and said, what do you think, to all my Facebook friends, what do you think the three biggest problems in the church are today, or in evangelicalism are today? And I'm going to show you that list in just a minute. And I'm going to suggest to you that those are not, in fact, the biggest problems. I'm going to suggest, in fact, that while many of them are real problems and big problems, that in many ways they're symptoms rather than causes. And what I'd like to do is to just spend a couple of minutes sharing with you what I think three of the big causes, the roots of those problems are, and also make a few suggestions for what we can do about them as well. Obviously, with a topic this big, I don't presume to have all the answers. In fact, I don't even presume to have all of the questions, but I know that you guys, because of your ongoing engagement with these issues and these questions, maybe can take some of these ideas on board and do something more and better with them than I would be able to do. So, by the way, this is the list that came to me from Facebook. Three, how about 3 times 10? And I left off a lot. I put 30 on here. In fact, one guy said the biggest problem, he was sort of channeling G.K. Chesterton whenever he said the biggest problem in the church is me, right? And I think that there is some truth to that as well. And in fact, I want to say a little bit more about that in a bit, because one of the solutions that I propose in a little bit, if I could steal my own thunder for just a minute, is that we need to develop a more robust biblical anthropology, that we have, that if you go to any seminary, you will take systematic theology, and virtually every theologian worth his salt or her salt would have written a systematic theology. But we don't, until recently, and I think there have been a couple of pretty good ones written recently, there hasn't been really a good systematic biblical anthropology, which is, who is man? What is man? Especially in relationship to God and our neighbors. What does it mean to love well? What are the consequences of the fall, for example? So I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. I don't want to steal my own thunder, but these are the 30 ideas that people came up with. But what I'm going to suggest again is that these are fruits and not roots of the problems that we're facing in evangelicalism today. That's not to say that they are not real problems, and it's not to say that some, on a hierarchy wouldn't be more important to deal with than others. But what I wanted to try to do tonight was just to say a few words about what I consider to be some of the root causes. I think that these are root causes that are not original to me, and I'll say a few words about the history of some of these ideas as well. And they are, but I do think, and they're not exclusively biblical. In other words, there's a robust, I think, biblical underpinning for some of the ideas that I'm going to share with you tonight. I didn't bring a lot of that scripture to tonight's presentation, but I think you guys, as a biblically fluent group can probably connect some of those dots yourself. And I will mention a few dots, but I do think that all of these ideas are profoundly biblical in a very important way. So what are these three toxic roots that are bearing the foul fruit, if I may torture a metaphor, that we're seeing in our culture today? One is one that I call the new provincialism, and I'm going to explain that in just a moment. The second one is what I call the triumph of sentimentality. And the third one is the Christian industrial complex. And I'm going to briefly explain all three of those ideas, but just mention again that most of these ideas I've unpacked in some detail in my book, A Lover's Quarrel with the Evangelical Church, which Jeffrey mentioned a few moments ago. And the book is out of print, which is why we're bringing it back into print. But if you can sometimes find it still online as a used book. So if you're interested in really exploring these ideas more fully, you can check them out there. So let me start, though, with the new provincialism and sort of define that term. What do I mean by the new provincialism? Well, the new provincialism is essentially this idea that in the modern age, we don't have a provincialism of space. In other words, we are not sort of relegated to our little corner of the world in the provinces, so to speak. That's what historically provincialism was, that, you know, it was somebody that was not cosmopolitan. You were either provincial or you were cosmopolitan. And we no longer really have that kind of provincialism of space anymore. Transportation, communication has more or less erased the provincialism of space in the 21st century. What we face today is a provincialism of time. We have forgotten our history. We have short memories. We don't understand that many of the ideas that are failing us today have failed generations past, but we have forgotten those lessons, and so we repeat the errors. I think it was Mark Twain who said that history doesn't exactly repeat itself, but it does rhyme. And I think that that's what we face in an era where we have this provincialism of time. This idea, again, not new to me. Alan Tate, one of the fugitive agrarian writers of the mid-20th century, actually coined the phrase the new provincialism. This idea that we live in a world where there's a provincialism not of space but of time. C.S. Lewis had a very similar idea when he talked about chronological snobbery. Now, he meant it in a specific way, in that we tend to think of our age as a superior age to those of ages past, and which is one of the reasons why C.S. Lewis was fond of recommending, I think, reading 10 old books for every one new book that you read. But I think that chronological snobbery in some ways works both ways, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that in just a second. There is a sort of a brand or a breed of us that tends to think that the past is bad and we live in a more enlightened age today. But I would say just as insidious and probably more common among Christians is this idea that that the past was better than today, that it was better in all ways than today, that we have nostalgia for the past. And we forget, for example, what Paul said at the Areopagus, that what Paul said at Mars Hill, which is that God himself prescribed the time in which we live and the boundaries of our dwelling places. And I think that that's a really important verse to keep in mind. It's only fitting that the Areopagus Forum is named for that very passage, that I think we can keep that passage in time. It will be a strong and powerful antidote against the kind of new provincialism that I'm talking about. And the symptoms of the new provincialism I've already mentioned. One of them is nostalgia for the past. I think another one of them is fear-based politics, politics that says things like America is going to hell in a bobsled, right? we need to make America great again, because it was great at some future date in the past, but it is not great today. And while those things may be true, I think they motivate in us, especially in Christians, a kind of fear that I think is not becoming to Christians. The Bible tells us that we're to love God and to love our neighbor. And I think one of the most important questions that Christians can ask themselves is, how can I love well? How can I love my neighbors well? And I think that having a fear-based understanding of the world is not helpful in figuring out how to love our neighbors well. Why? Because the Bible teaches us that perfect love casts out not hate, but fear. And so I think that fear and love are in direct contradiction. And I think the nostalgia for the past tends to create sort of fear-based politics. And if we wanted to wander very far afield, I would even say that postmodern worship styles that forget the history of our church and the liturgies of our church and the lessons of our church, the music of our church. I think that is one manifestation of the new provincialism that we see today. And so what's the solution to the new provincialism? I say it's a greater confidence in the sovereignty of God. Once again, God chose the time and the place that we are to live. God in his sovereignty said, Warren, we are to live in this time and in this place. And I think we should trust God's sovereignty, and we should ask ourselves the question, why? Why did God put us here? For what purpose did God put me here? What is it about this time and this place? Does God want me to be his hands and feet? How does he want me to be his hands and feet? How does he want us to be the body of Christ? So I think, again, a big part of the solution to the new provincialism is to understand the sovereignty of God. And of course, that's what that passage in Acts 17 really is all about. It is about the sovereignty of God. It was when Paul was actually trying to explain who is the true God, and he made the point that the true God is the sovereign God, the God above all gods. And I think that's an important lesson for us to remember today as well. Okay, number two, and I'll move quickly through the next couple so we can have a lot of time for Q&A. The triumph of sentimentality. So what do I mean by that? Well, sentimentality, my definition of sentimentality is the world as we would like it to be, rather than the world as it is. This beautiful but broken world that God has made. I think as Christians, we are called not to be sentimentalist, not to be either optimist or pessimist, but to be Christian realist, to understand that in the beginning, God created, that the fact that God created the world in a particular way is an important reality of the world, and it's a reality that we should seek to understand. Of course, there is also the fall as well. So we have to take into account that while God made the world good, in fact, he declared it good time after time after time in the creation account, it is also a broken world. And I'm going to say a little bit more about that in a minute. But again, I'm not the first person to identify this problem. Some of you may know Richard Weaver's famous book, Ideas Have Consequences. And if you know that book, you know that the first chapter of that book is called The Unsentimental Sentiment. And what Richard Weaver was advocating was a kind of realism in the way we look out at the world, that we look at the world to try to understand what it really is, what its true nature is, so that we can be obedient to God's command in the Garden of Eden to us to name the animals. If you remember that story from Genesis chapter 2, God brought all the animals to Adam and asked Adam to name them. And the Bible then says, whatever Adam called the animal, that was its name. So there's some very, really important stuff going on there. It's that Adam, who was still in fellowship with God at that time, had an understanding of the world that was informed by that close fellowship with God. In other words, he could look out at the world and see the world as it really was, and the names that he gave to those animals really reflected that reality. And I think that should be our posture in the world today. We should look at the world as it is, be honest about it, be truthful about it when we're telling the story of the world to ourselves and to others. E.C. Hoskins wrote in the 19th century, "There is no corruption that threatens a country so surely as the sentimentalizing of religion." And Fitz Allison, who is in his 90s now, but still alive, at least the last time I checked, and bishop in the Anglican Church, said this: "We are susceptible to heretical teachings because they nurture and reflect the way we would have it rather than the way God has provided." And I think that there is just a lot of wisdom in both of those quotations. So what are some of the symptoms of the triumph of sentimentality today? I think among them are the prosperity gospel, kind of feel-good evangelicalism that we see in people like Joel Osteen, for example. I think that this idea of wanting to craft a gospel that makes us feel good rather than gives us the power to be good and to be ultimately reconciled to God himself is an important distinction that we need to make. And I think that we can trace a lot of the problems that we see in evangelicalism today to that. And once again, I would hearken us back to that idea that I mentioned earlier, that the solution to this sentimentality that I see in the church is a biblical anthropology. In other words, a biblical understanding of who and what man is. Yes, we are made in the image of God. Yes, Ephesians tells us that we are the masterpiece, the Nike of God's creation, but we're also broken. We're desperately broken. That the brokenness of the world and the evil that we see in the world is nobody's fault but ours. We did that. God is innocent. And when we understand, I think, both the beauty of the world and the profound brokenness of the world, it can somehow hold those two together. I think it gives us a much greater and more rich understanding of who God is, what the world is, and our place in it. Okay, thirdly, then, I'll just be real brief on this one because so much has been written about this in recent years, including by me, that it probably doesn't need too much more. The Christian industrial complex is just kind of this devil's brew, you might say, this witch's cauldron of ministry and money and platform and celebrity kind of all thrown into the same pot and stirred up. And I just think it has such a destructive and corrosive impact on the evangelical church today and evangelical church's witness in the world. And we can talk more about that as we go along. Maybe it'd be prudent for me to save most of that for the Q&A, but I'll just say that I'm not sure I originated that expression originally, but I hadn't seen it before. Since then, I've seen it a lot. I'm not sure exactly where it comes from. I got it from Dwight D. Eisenhower's famous saying the military industrial complex. He had a very real concern as early as the 1940s and 50s that this cooperation between the private for-profit sector and the military was going to have a deeply corrosive impact on our government and on our politics. I think he's largely been proven right about that. And I think the same problem is happening in the church today. And one of the reasons why I elevate the Christian industrial complex to the level of the top three problems is in fact a scriptural, has a scriptural basis. 1 Timothy teaches that the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. Now, again, not money, but the love of money. And again, it's not just the root of evil, but all different kinds of evil. So I do think that many of the problems that we see in the evangelical church today can be traced to this kind of, this Christian industrial complex. I have somehow, hold on just a second. There we go, I'm back. Apologize if that was a glitch. It was a glitch on my screen. I hope it wasn't a glitch on your screen. And so what are some of the symptoms of the Christian industrial complex? Well, I've mentioned a couple of them already: celebrity and platform. I remember having a conversation with Philip Yancey, who wrote a book, What's So Amazing About Grace. And I'm whatever you think about Philip Yancey or whatever you think about that book, I will simply say that in my conversation with Philip, he said, I don't think that book could be published today, because at the time it was published, he was an unknown author. And he said it's impossible for unknown authors to get published today because they've got to have a platform. They got to have 20,000, social media followers and so on and so forth. So it's it's a real problem in the church today that this celebrity, this status, this platform is really kind of what's carrying the day. And another symptom that might require a little bit of explanation is letting Becky choose our worship music. Becky is this mythical audience member that all the Christian music radio stations around the country are programming their music to. Now, it's great if you are a radio station or a television station or a business of any kind to know who your target audience is. The problem with Becky is that she is probably not a Christian. She listens to the radio, Christian radio, in the car because you got a bunch of, maybe have kids in the car. She wants a radio station that is safe for the entire family, forgetting that Aslan was not a safe lion. He was a good lion, but he was not a safe lion. And so as a consequence, we are essentially letting Becky program the music that we're playing in our church. What Becky loves on the radio is what Becky loves is what gets played on the radio, and what gets played on the radio is what worship leaders at contemporary churches all over the country start singing in their worship services. That's a long conversation that, Jeffrey, we can talk about only if you want to dig into more, but I'll just say that I think it's one of the symptoms of the this Christian industrial complex. And finally, what is the solution? My answers are that transparency and accountability are an important part of the solutions to this problem, because what ends up happening is that these TV preachers and folks that are building their platforms, they build these parachurch ministries that no one can look into. There's no accountability. There's no board of directors. There's no elders. There's no deacons. They're accountable to no one. And as a consequence, they get large. They become corrupt over time. And that's why we see many of the scandals that we see in the church with Hillsong, with Ravi Zacharias, with so many others. So I think, Jeffrey, that's pretty much all I wanted to kind of say. I keep getting a message coming up on my screen. Are y'all seeing that message? Or anyone that says?
Yeah,
okay.
We're trying to catch it. The person pops in and out. We're trying to catch it and get rid of it.
Okay, sorry about that.
Yeah, he's popping in and back out again right away.
I just keep hitting decline, so I apologize for if that's being disruptive. Anyway, the one thing I did want to mention though is that and if you'll allow me just 30 seconds of shameless self-promotion, I've got a couple of books that are free. They're absolutely free. You can just go to our website and download those that I think might be not books, but this is a booklet, and this is an article, When a Church is Not a Church, which is
in Hunter's case pretty soon,
outlining what I think is a troubling trend in the church today. So, Jeffrey, that was kind of it for me. And if any of you guys want to interact with me individually, this is my email address on the screen, and I'd be delighted to hear from you. And with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I think. Is that what you want me to do, Jeffrey?
Yeah, that would be fine. Mm-hmm.
And I will hope that wasn't too fast and too glib, but maybe we can, if it was, we can unpack some of it with the questions.
Warren, I have not yet read your latest book, Faith-Based Fraud. Is part of what you just shared derived from that book?
Part of it is, yeah, faith-based fraud is really making the case for transparency and accountability in the ministry marketplace, to the end that we hope to restore credibility of the marketplace. And I look at some of the financial and other scandals like Bill Hybels and Willow Creek Church. I've got a chapter devoted to Mark Driscoll and Mars Hill Church. I've got, I won't itemize them all, but yeah, we look at those stories, not to take satisfaction. I have to constantly remind myself that some of you may know the German word Schadenfreude, which we don't really have an exact American or English translation of, but it essentially means taking pleasure in the misfortune of another, is kind of what Schadenfreude means. And I have to remind myself that Schadenfreude is a sin. Schadenfreude is not an appropriate Christian response to the troubles of others. But so we don't, I hope that I outline these stories, not again to take any sort of pleasure or to gloat or to say, to be pharisaical in any way, but rather to say, what can we learn from them? What can we see in our own lives that might be similar to what we saw in these terrible scandals? And maybe there's some actions and some steps, some safeguards, some guardrails that we need to build into our own lives and ministries to make sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen to us.
Well, that correlates very well with the first question I wanted to pose to you, and that is, I'm oftentimes reminded by the famous quote from Yaroslav Pelikan, who was a famous Yale University church historian. And Pelikan, this is a paraphrase, but Pelikan essentially stated that the church should always be more than a school. In other words, church should always be more than just an education institution, but the church should never be less than a school. So why are so many churches, you think, so reluctant to keep their members informed regarding the great issues of our time, issues that you oftentimes are commenting on in your ministry, right, including significant theological and moral controversies and scandals within their own denomination or their own association of churches? Most denominational people, this would probably extend from Pentecostals, to Southern Baptists to Episcopalians, probably hardly have a clue what is going on in their denomination, for instance. And why do you think that's the case, that these issues are rarely ever addressed in the local church?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And, I don't have a really great answer. I hate to impute motive to people, but I just think that that's kind of dangerous. But I will say that this kind of work is hard. And, I can tell you that in my own life, looking at these kinds of stories that we have to report on at Ministry Watch day after day after day, can be difficult. And I can understand why people would want to avert their gaze, that they would want to turn away from this stuff. That said, I believe that staring these kinds of problems in the eye is vitally important. Jeffrey, we just came out of the Easter season, or in some church traditions, we're still in the Easter season. We're out of the season of Lent. And it always, for some reason, God impressed on my heart this year, more than perhaps in years past, the notion of why do we call Good Friday Good Friday? It was arguably the worst day in the history of the world, looked at from a single, from a very narrow perspective. It was the day that Jesus died. I mean, what a horrible day. On the one hand, we could say that was. Yet, throughout church history, we've never not called it Good Friday. We've never shied away from, and that's because we have an understanding of the full biblical story. And when we understand the full biblical story, including, of course, the resurrection and the church age in which God is calling us now to be reconcilers in this world, we can call Good Friday with great confidence, even though something horrible happened that day. And I think that, and I don't want to over spiritualize, what we do at Ministry Watch or journalism, but I think there's a little bit of that attitude that we need to have in the church today, is that we need to understand that without confronting our sin, without looking it squarely in the eye and repenting of it, that there can be no true reconciliation and restoration. And when we start looking at these kinds of stories, not as, bad news exclusively, but as the beginning steps towards the good news, I think that kind of a reframing will serve the church well, and it will allow us to more directly confront these stories that, as you rightly said, Jeffrey, we're just not confronting in our churches today. Let me just, for those of you that are pastors out there, I don't know if any of you are pastors on this call, I will also say that I've gotten to be really good friends with a lot of pastors over the years, including my current pastor. He and I have become very close friends. And I have a lot of sympathy for pastors. They have a lot of things, they have a lot of competing issues tugging at them in this environment. So I wish pastors would speak out more, Jeffrey, as I know you do, and you're that's sort of implicit in your question. But man, oh man, I have a lot of sympathy for them. I think we should be praying for our pastors, and we should be praying for courage though as well. Among the things that we should be praying for is courage. So
yeah. C.S. Lewis wrote, in Mere Christianity, the most rare of all the virtues is courage.
Yeah.
I think that's rather self-evident.
Yeah. By the way, Jeffrey, and I hate to do this, but just one more quick thought, because I know Paul's on the line and he's going to talk about the Colson Fellows. One of the things that I really love about the Colson Fellows program is that it's got this wonderful combination of head and heart. That it is a school. I mean, you read a lot of books, and you do. It's pretty rigorous intellectual work. And there's actually, I'm patting myself a little bit on the back because they used one of my books in the Colson Fellows program. So there's that. But it's also about matters of the heart as well. That the Colson Fellows program is both a school. It's concerned about intellectual formation, but it's also concerned about faith formation as well. There's a devotional element to it that I think is just really vital. So again, not trying to wander afield here or steal Paul's thunder from next month, but I consider the Colson Fellows program, at least in part, Jeffrey, to be a response to what you just said, that the church, for better, for maybe for good reasons, the outcome was bad. They've abandoned this kind of conversation, and the Colson Fellows have sort of stepped into that breach in the wall, and I think that's a very good thing.
Well, thank God that's the case, because so many Christians, I guess overwhelmingly, have not a clue what's going on in their own denomination, let alone in Christianity in general. Now, this question I wrote out prior to your presentation, but I think it's nonetheless relevant, and that is in the Areopagus, we oftentimes address the threats posed by two obvious heresies: liberal, so-called progressive Christianity, and on the other hand, the word of faith prosperity gospel. But what do you see as the most troubling trend developing in evangelical churches?
Yeah, well, I mean, both of those that you just identified are real problems. We've been writing about, at Ministry Watch, we've been writing about the prosperity gospel, word of faith movement, whatever you want to call it, for years. Progressive Christianity is, I don't want to say it's a new thing. I mean, if you go back to the early 20th century, Machen was fighting, a similar battle in the early 20th century. So, I think both of those are really profound, important issues that we face in the church today. I kind of lost track of your question though, Jeffrey. Is
Well,
one more severe than the other? Is that what you were asking?
Well, actually, I would say, what do you find to be the most troubling trend in evangelicalism, which typically is not associated with either progressive Christianity, at least it hasn't been in the past, or is it usually associated with the word of faith, prosperity gospel? So within evangelicalism per se.
Yeah. Well, that's a Hobson's choice. I wouldn't want. They're both bad. I think in some ways though it might depend on where you are. I mean, if you look at in Brazil, like let's just look at Brazil just real quickly. I've only been to Brazil once, but it's kind of one of those deals where once you go to a country, you start getting interested in the country and you start reading a lot about it. You go to Brazil and superficially, nominally, that's a Christian country. Nominally, there's a huge evangelical population there. But if you look at it closely, it does not resemble biblical Christianity in many particulars. I mean, I'm sure there are many godly and faithful people in Brazil. I mean, it's a big country with a lot of people. So I'm sure that there are some godly, faithful Christian people in Brazil. But a lot of it is prosperity gospel mixed in with animism and other kinds of crazy stuff. You see that throughout Africa as well. I know a few years ago, Phil Jenkins wrote a book, I think it was called The Next Christendom, about sort of the rise of the global South. And again, some fantastic godly people. I've been to India a couple of times, and I've met some folks in India, for example, that are just doing remarkable work for the kingdom, as theologically solid as as Aquinas or Augustine. But so I don't want to overgeneralize, but there's just also a lot of crazy stuff. So I would say in the developing world, in the majority world, the global South, that I would say the prosperity gospel might be a bigger problem. In the United States and a lot of the Western countries, I would say maybe more progressive Christianity would be the bigger problem.
Well, and I think within, traditional evangelical Christianity, I think you basically highlighted in your presentation the problem with this Christian industrial complex, which is as problematic in evangelicalism as in any other type of Christianity, and also the kind of the cult of celebrity Christianity as well. Yeah. I had one more question and then we'll open things up here. Earlier today, you and I exchanged some thoughts on a new Christian film that's generated some interest, entitled Enemies Within the Church. And this film purports to deal with woke neo-Marxist influences in evangelicalism, including not only theological heresies, but also immoral policies such as critical race theory and the LGBTQ agenda. Why do you think it is that so many evangelical church, and we talked about some of the problems in that film in particular. It needs to be watched with discretion and discernment, to say the least. But why is it that so many evangelical church leaders are so susceptible to so much of this left-wing propaganda that's obviously explicitly anti-Christian?
Yeah, it's a great question. I don't have a simple answer for that. I think that there are two points that I would maybe make, Jeffrey. One is that, we all want to be loved, right? We all, it's always better to be loved than to be hated. Or it's easier to be loved than to be hated. And I think that, there is a certain class of clergy that just likes to get along, that just wants to be that hail fellow well met kind of a guy, and they don't want to rock the boat. They've got pensions, they've got mortgages, they've got whatever is keeping them from kind of playing flat out in their vocational lives. I think that is one part of it. And also though, to I think one of the things that we have to do it's a discipline that I try to exercise as a journalist, is that I like to ask, okay, like what is the best possible motivation for those folks, right? In other words, yeah, maybe they're being seduced, maybe they're being cowardly, but is there maybe a more honorable motivation that I should at least consider before I write them off altogether? I know as a journalist, we have to do that all the time. And I think that a part of what's going on here, and I think this is something that it's important for those of us who are theologically and politically conservative to face, is that, we do have some real problems in this country. And, we have problems with race. We have problems with poverty. We have, other problems that that have just been steadfast in our culture that we've not been able to solve. And so I do think that there is a level of frustration that boils up within the body politic that says, why can't we solve these problems? Maybe we should try something new. Maybe we should try something different. I mean, critical race theory, I think it's anti-Christian. I think it is anti-biblical, but it's new. I can imagine a certain kind of pastor or evangelical at least taking a look at it. And, it's, so I don't want to completely write off, I don't want to demonize the folks who disagree with me on some of these points without at least trying to fully consider, where they're coming from. And so all that said, I want to give at least a little bit of the benefit of the doubt that maybe some pastors are just saying, hey, maybe I ought to at least explore it before I reject it. And if that's the case, then explore, but then reject because it's not biblical.
Yeah, they'd never hold white racism though to such a similar standard, would they? Yeah. So that's what's so troubling about it is we need to be consistent across the board. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly right.
Eric, let me turn it over to you. We have 20 minutes and we do need to cut off promptly at 8:15. But would you pick it up at this point with the questions that have come in via chat? Thanks.
Okay, so first of all, just let everyone know that we have locked the meeting down to deal with some issues. So if you leave, you can't come back. So make sure you don't leave until you really intend to. So I shall take the moderator's prerogative and ask the first question myself. And this is something I thought you were going to be going with when you talked about the triumph of sentimentality, but you sort of went in a different direction. So I was wondering, how much of a problem do you think sort of the evangelical church's reliance on emotion and and this ties into the whole praise and worship thing, is that we're much more emotion driven than choice or thought driven.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And you're right. I didn't unpack that idea very much, but I think it's of a piece with what I was saying. I think it's absolutely consistent with what I was saying. Yeah, we want, in fact, in the original version of a lover's quarrel with the Evangelical Church, I quote Flannery O'Connor, in which she says, she's actually quoting one of her evil characters in her book Wise Blood, and he says this: if you want to get anywheres in this religion game, you got to keep it sweet. And I think that what she was getting at is exactly what you're getting at, Eric, is that we want a religion that makes us feel good. We don't want a religion that confronts us with our humanity, confronts us with our sin, that confronts us with our need for a savior. And that is uncomfortable for many of us. We want to feel good. We want that to show up in our churches. We want our best life now, which could not be which is the name, for those of you who don't know, that was the name of Joel Osteen's best-selling book, Your Best Life Now. And if you got 20 smart people in a room and said to them, come up with 20 smart biblical theologians in a room and said, come up with the title of a book that is anti-biblical. You know, I don't think you could do a better job than the title Your Best Life Now. So yeah, I mean, that's what we want. We want to be as God. We don't want to be in submission to a God. And so yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so the next question from Paul and Millie Atkinson says, can you comment more on the RZIM scandal? I learned a lot from Robbie's podcasts and books, also from many of his very learned associates, but now it seems that no one will list RZIM on their CVs when they speak. I won't name any of them, but it has become like a scarlet A to have ever worked with RZIM.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great question. I knew Robbie. We weren't close friends, but you know, I knew him pretty well. And when I was at the Colson Center, Robbie spoke, I think, at least 1 year, maybe 2 years, at the Wilberforce weekend that I helped. I was responsible for the Wilberforce weekend, and I brought him in to speak. So it's a real tragedy. I mean, I don't know what does I've got so many thoughts about Robbie that and RZIM that I have a hard time editing myself, and I certainly won't be able to get them all in the 15 minutes we've got left. I will simply say this, that I think Robbie was brilliant. I think he was extraordinarily gifted, both intellectually and as a communicator. But I think what happened to Robbie is what would happen to any of us if we were in his situation. And that is that we got in a situation, Robbie allowed himself, and I don't think there's any other way to say it, he allowed himself to be put in a situation where he had no transparency in his life. People could no longer see into his life. He spent months and months overseas in rented apartments, living alone. He said that it was for writing time, but we now know that that was not all of what was going on whenever he was doing that. They stopped releasing their Form 990s to the public, which meant that we could no longer see how much key executives were making there. We could no longer see that there were many family members on the staff and on the board of Ravi Zacharias International Ministries. These were problems. The Bible says that as Christians, we are children of the light, and we should walk in the light. In journalism, we have an old saying that sunlight is the best disinfectant. And I think Ravi, though he should have known better, allowed himself to be in a dark place, isolated from people, isolated from accountability, in a way where people couldn't see into his life. And I think the inevitable occurred. When that happens, bad behaviors develop. And those bad behaviors were what ultimately brought down Ravi and the entire ministry. And I think it's a real tragedy, because I agree with whoever said a moment ago that Ravi was brilliant. I mean, he said so many beautiful things, so many helpful things to me in my life over the years. But unfortunately, character really does matter. And I think that there's, going to be a season where we're going to have to put Ravi Zacharias in the rearview mirror. That's my opinion. I got more to say about that, but I'll stop there.
So Ray asks, how should a church deal with politics, specifically the political aspects of life, marriage and family, and religious freedom?
Yeah. So it's a great question. I would say 2 or 3 things about that. And this kind of goes beyond the scope of what I was talking about. But if I could have named 4 things, Jeffrey, instead of just 3 tonight. The 4th one was going to be that the Evangelical Church has succumbed to the political illusion. And the political illusion is an idea that I first learned of through the French philosopher Jacques Ellul. And Jacques Ellul basically said that the political illusion is when you think that all problems are political problems, therefore all solutions are political solutions. And there's no question that God is sovereign over all. I tend to be Kuyperian in my approach to politics, which is that God declares there's not one thumb's width of all of creation over which Christ does not declare mine. That was the famous quote from Abraham Kuyper, sometimes translated not 1 square inch. So I believe that Christians should absolutely be involved in politics. And there's no question that there are certain issues like sanctity of life, like marriage, which have both moral and political implications. But I think Christians, at least in this day and age, we need to pick our battles very carefully. We should be absolutely uncompromising on those things that the Bible is clear about, but we should not add to or subtract from what the Bible is clear about. We should render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, but unto God what is God's. And I think too many people are willing to sacrifice their commitment to the truth in order to remain loyal to a particular political party. And I think that that is a real danger. On the other hand, I think that there are also a lot of Christians that will say, well, marriage, I've got gay friends. What's so wrong with being gay? They don't really understand what the Bible teaches about humanity and about sexuality. And again, that's where I think a more robust biblical anthropology would serve the church very well. I know I'm not 100% sure I answered the question, so but maybe you could find an answer in there somewhere.
So Bruce Phillips asks, early in your presentation, you said that we have a nostalgia for the past, but then shortly thereafter, you critique the postmodern worship styles for forgetting the past. So can you elaborate on those two poles? What's the relationship between them?
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And I guess I would defend myself by saying that as Christians, we've got to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time, that both of those things can be true, right? That we can have both nostalgia for the past, and we can also forget our history, right? We can remember only those things about our history that we want to remember. It's easy to venerate, the Ozzie and Harriet of the 1950s, and really easy to forget the Jim Crow laws that were still very much a part of American life in the 1950s. So, if we are going to, we've got to remember our history, but we've got to tell the truth, whether we're talking about today or whether we're talking about 100 years ago. And so I do think that it's a both and not an either or, and that we as Christians have to be able and willing to hold sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 ideas in tension together, and so I think that those can both be true. But yeah, I think that postmodernism is I think that at the end of the day, the way you square that circle, the way you reconcile that paradox, is that neither postmodernism nor which is basically the French philosopher Jean-Francois Lyotard said that postmodernism is incredulity towards the meta-narrative. In other words, there was no belief in an overarching story. And so what I would say is that what postmoderns and those that are nostalgic for the past have in common is that they both bear false witness. They both fail to tell the truth about the world. And one of them chooses to forget the past, and the other one chooses to forget all about the past that made the past not so great. So it's I think it's something that as Christians we've got to be very thoughtful about it. We've got to realize that as Christians, like I said, we've got to learn to walk and chew gum at the same time.
So next question, have you seen the research trends about young Christians leaving the faith soon after they leave home? Are the congregations aware that this is a growing trend? Should the church do more now? And if so, what?
Yeah, I've been seeing these numbers for 30 years, honestly, and I'm not. I think probably they might be a little bit worse now than they were maybe 10 or 20 or 30 years ago. I'm not sure about that, but I think that could be true. Yeah, the thing that we don't do in our youth groups, in our churches, is that we don't really engage in faith formation. Which again, if I could talk, I've mentioned the Colson Fellows program a few times. The Colson Center works very actively with a group called Summit Ministries, and I'm a regular speaker at Summit Ministries as well. And they are a 2-week-long worldview camp, Christian worldview camp, that talks about, what is a worldview, what are the various worldviews, postmodernism, Islam, Christianity, and so on. And they've identified 7 that they unpack. And then they talk about a lot of contemporary issues: same-sex marriage, homosexuality generally, gender identity, abortion, and so on. And I would strongly recommend, if you're a parent or a grandparent, I've sent 2 of my kids to Summit Ministries. 2 of them were aged out before I had a chance before I knew about them. My pastor just sent his son to Summit Ministries, and they offer scholarships to the children of pastors and those in ministry work. And if you are not in ministry work, you should consider sending a kid to Summit Ministries. And it's that kind of training. I mean, we can't do drive-by 45 minutes on Tuesday night discipleship, pizza party and paintballs and 10 minutes of a little devotion on a Sunday night or a Tuesday night is just not going to get it. It never got it, but it's certainly not going to get it today. And but there are options out there. Summit Ministries is a great option. For those of you, or your kids or your grandkids are homeschooling them, there's an organization in Charlotte called Apologia that does Christian worldview apologetics curriculum for homeschool kids. I strongly recommend that. But listen, it's gonna take real effort. It's gonna take time. It took us 100 years to get here. It might take us 100 years to get out of here. We've got to take our kids, and we've got to, like I say, it can't be drive-by faith formation. It's got to be a concerted effort over many days, weeks, months, years, and even decades of being in their lives.
I have to say about Summit Ministries, I've got what I think are probably 3 of their textbooks: Understanding the Times, Understanding the Culture, and Understanding the Faith, and they really are excellent.
Yeah. So
hopefully when our daughter's older, we'd be able to send her. So another question, which I'm guessing will probably be our last. As a journalist, I'm curious what your thoughts are in regard to the former president that claimed nearly everything with which he disagreed was fake news. Right.
Wow, I almost got out of here alive without saying the T word. Well, I would simply say about President Trump that again, the political illusion should not capture Christians. Whether it's Donald Trump or Joe Biden, Ronald Reagan, Barack Obama, whomever it might be, that our allegiance is not to Caesar, but to God. And we should affirm Trump or any other president whenever he is saying things that we as Christians can agree with, but our loyalty should not be so great that we can't criticize him when he says and does things that are clearly anti-biblical. And so I think that would be my main comment. And it's not really a comment I would make about Trump. It's a comment I would make about any political leader. As Christians, our affiliation should not be to a political party. We should be fundamentally independent. That independence should give us credibility when we praise somebody, and it also should give us both credibility and standing when we choose to criticize someone as well. And so I think that if I were king of the world, that's the posture that Christians would have in the public square, a level of independence that whose primary loyalty was to God's truth and would evaluate all politicians based on that straight stick of Scripture.
Well, we have 2 minutes left, so maybe we can get a really quick answer to this one.
Sure.
Well-run companies do research on how well their product is received. Should churches do more assessment of how well their discipleship programs are working by seeing how many stay with the Lord after leaving home for work or college?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and I'm going to answer because I've only got 2 minutes. I'm going to say my short answer to that question is yes. I've got a million caveats though to that. I think that the church needs to be very, 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 very careful that it doesn't measure its success based on public opinion surveys. That Chuck Colson, one of my mentors, was fond of saying that your responsibility is faithfulness. The results are up to God. Stay at your post and do your duty, Chuck would say often. And so I think that, I think that if a survey like the kind you're talking about, Eric, or I don't know who the questioner was, would reveal that we are truly not doing a great job of faithfully passing on our faith to our children, I think that's a lesson that we need to learn. And that if that kind of a study or survey would put it in black and white for us, then I'd say yes. But again, I'm very nervous about a church that crafts who it is in the community and what it is in the world based on the results of public opinion surveys. I think that that's what the seeker-sensitive model was all about, and I think that led us down a very, very dangerous path that we're paying a price for today.
Well, Warren, thank you very much. Very enlightening. I appreciate all that you had to share this evening. Wish we had more time. If you didn't have to eat, we could go till midnight tonight.
Yeah, well, I'm speaking here at a conference and they've asked me to be at an event tonight, so I apologize for that. But it's been great fun being with you. Thank you, Jeffrey. It's always
well, absolutely. Well, we'll have to bring you back before too much longer and continue some of these themes that have emerged. So thank you. Blessings, continued blessings on your ministry. Thanks for all that you do. You make great contributions to informed Christianity. I only wish, again, that your ministry and others as well were more acknowledged and frankly promoted in our local churches.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate that. You're very generous. Thank you so much. Blessings to all of you guys. God bless you. Thank you. It's been fun to be with you tonight.
Great being with you. Good night. Thank you all for being with us.